They found an engine in a swamp outside Minsk in 1973. The excavation team that pulled it out assumed it was industrial salvage from the war. They photographed it, filed a report, and moved on. The report sits in a regional archive that has never been digitized. Nobody followed up because nobody knew what question to ask. The engine, by the measurements recorded in that report, displaced more than 4 times the volume of a comparable modern diesel, weighed approximately half as much, and showed no evidence of an internal combustion chamber. Nobody followed up because nobody knew what question to ask. That is almost always how it begins. Not with suppression, not with men in dark rooms deciding what the public is allowed to know, with the simpler, more total erasure of context. You cannot investigate what you cannot categorize. You cannot categorize what your entire training has prepared you to regard as impossible. The engine sat in that archive for 50 years, not because it was hidden, but because the people who found it had no framework for understanding what they had found, and the people who might have had that framework had, by 1973, been educated out of it entirely. The framework was Tartarian. And before you reach for the reflex, before the part of your mind that has been carefully maintained to produce a specific response to that word begins producing it, consider what the cartographic record actually shows. Tartaria on the authoritative maps of the 16th and 17th centuries is not marginal. It is central. It is labeled with the specificity of a civilization that someone knew well enough to document in detail. Internal provinces, named cities, trade corridors, the kind of cartographic confidence you only bring to something you have visited, measured, and understood. And among the things those maps notate, in the margins and the legend keys and the explanatory texts that European cartographers attached to justify their depictions, are references to the means by which Tartarian commerce and administration moved across that enormous territory. Not horses, not carts, something else. Something the cartographers struggled to name because they had no native vocabulary for it. The word they reached for, across multiple independent cartographic traditions, across Flemish and French and Portuguese sources that had no coordinating relationship with each other, was some variation of a term that translates, approximately, as self-moving, self-impelled, a vehicle that generated its own motive force from a source the observers could witness, but not explain. 16 cartographic documents, 4 linguistic traditions, 0 coordination between the sources. 1 description. Here is the problem with the timeline of mechanical propulsion as the official history presents it. The internal combustion engine, in the form that made the automobile possible, is dated to the 1880s. Nicholas Otto, Carl Benz. The standard sequence that every engineering curriculum reproduces without friction, because it has been reproduced without friction for so long that the questioning of it feels like the questioning of arithmetic. The sequence is steam, then internal combustion, then refinement, then the modern car. Linear, progressive, each development building on the one before in a chain of attribution that names specific inventors, specific patents, specific dates. The problem is the objects that predate the sequence. In 1889, during the demolition of a building in Cincinnati that the city records date to 1851, workers uncovered a sub-basement that the building's own documentation did not mention. Inside the sub-basement were storage racks, and on the storage racks were components. Machined components, some still in what appeared to be original packing material, made from alloys that a metallurgical analysis conducted at the time and recorded in the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette on March 14th of that year, could not fully characterize. The analysis identified the primary metal as a variant of aluminum, which is unremarkable. What is remarkable is that the secondary alloying elements produced a tensile strength that the analyst noted, with evident confusion, exceeded anything currently achievable in commercial aluminum production. In 1889, when the techniques for producing high-strength aluminum alloys were not developed until the early 20th century, Under industrial pressures that the official history traces to aircraft manufacturing demands, the components were catalogued, 23 of them. The catalogue was published in the Gazette, and then the components were transferred through a chain of institutional handoffs that the documentary record traces as far as a receiving inventory at the Smithsonian dated 1891, after which they do not appear in any subsequent Smithsonian catalogue that has been made available for public research. 23 components, machined, alloys that shouldn't have existed, a sub-basement that the building's own records didn't acknowledge, and a receiving inventory that marks the last moment they appear in any document you are allowed to examine. The architecture of Tartarian transportation technology, pieced together from the sources that remain available, follows a pattern that the standard history of engineering cannot accommodate and therefore does not attempt to address. Not because the sources are obscure, because the sources are legible only within a framework that the standard history has spent considerable institutional energy making unavailable. The framework is this: Tartarian civilization, at its operational peak, which the cartographic evidence places somewhere between the 14th and 17th centuries, had solved a problem that modern engineering solved in the 20th and is still solving imperfectly in the 21st. The problem of energy density, of storing and releasing motive force in a package compact enough, stable enough, and efficient enough to move a vehicle across variable terrain without constant resupply. Modern electric vehicles solve this problem badly. A contemporary lithium-ion battery pack, capable of moving a passenger vehicle 400 kilometers, weighs, depending on the vehicle, between 400 and 800 kilograms. It degrades. It is sensitive to temperature. It requires a charging infrastructure whose construction cost, at global scale, runs into the trillions. The problem, after 140 years of sustained industrial effort and more than $2 trillion in cumulative research investment, is not solved. It is managed. There is a meaningful difference. The objects recovered from sites associated with the pre-renaming urban landscape, the buildings that predate the engineering knowledge that supposedly produced them, the sub-basements that the official building records don't acknowledge, describe a different solution. Not battery-based, not combustion-based. The closest analogy in the modern technical vocabulary is resonance, a system that draws on the electromagnetic properties of the surrounding environment, that uses the planet's own field geometry as a medium, and that requires no fuel in the combustion sense because it is not burning anything. It is tuning. The way a tuning fork does not generate sound so much as it reveals sound that was already present in the medium, a Tartarian vehicle, by this description, did not generate motive force so much as it extracted motive force that was already present in the field it moved through. This sounds, in the vocabulary of modern physics, like a perpetual motion claim. It is not. Perpetual motion posits energy creation from nothing. This posits energy extraction from an existing field, which is not thermodynamically impossible, which is in fact the operating principle of several technologies that exist today and are in routine use, technologies whose theoretical underpinnings, traced carefully back through their citation histories, lead to researchers whose work was defunded, whose institutional affiliations were quietly ended, whose papers were not rejected so much as simply never reviewed, in a pattern that begins, with reliable consistency, in the 1920s. The same decade in which the last Tartarian street names were being removed from the municipal records of American cities. There are 3 vehicles that the available documentation describes with enough specificity to reconstruct in functional outline, not in engineering detail. The engineering detail is in the components that disappeared into the Smithsonian's uncatalogued inventory, in the reports filed by the Minsk excavation team that were never digitized, in the records of the building demolitions that the urban improvement initiatives of 1890 to 1920 conducted with a speed and a thoroughness that the financing for those initiatives has never entirely satisfactorily explained. The functional outline is recoverable, the outline is damning enough. The first is what the documentary sources call, in translation, a ground runner, a vehicle designed for surface transport across the steppe and the high-altitude plateaus that constitute the interior of the Tartarian geographic sphere. The descriptions that survive, in the accounts of European travelers whose journals are held at the Bibliothèque Nationale and at the Bodleian, agree on several features. It was low to the ground. It was silent, which every account mentions because silence was apparently notable, because the absence of the animal noise that European travelers associated with transport was conspicuous and required explanation. It moved faster than horses over distance, not in sprint, but in sustained travel, maintaining speeds that the accounts estimate in terms of landmarks passed per hour in a way that, converted to modern units, suggests something in the range of 60 to 80 kilometers per hour across unprepared terrain. 60 to 80 kilometers per hour across unprepared steppe. In silence, without horses, in an era that the official history of transportation places firmly in the horse and cart period, with no mechanical supplement. The second is what the sources call, again in translation, a sky skimmer, though that translation is contested and some scholars who have worked with the original texts prefer surface flyer or ground cloud depending on which manuscript tradition they are drawing from. The descriptions are less consistent here, which suggests either that the vehicle was rarer or that the observers were further from the ground and therefore describing something with less precision. What the accounts agree on is elevation, not flight in the aircraft sense, not altitude. A consistent separation from the surface of somewhere between 1 and 3 meters, maintained without visible mechanical support, without the downward air displacement that would be associated with any rotary lift system, in a stillness that the observers universally found more unsettling than the motion itself. Hovering, in silence, between 1 and 3 meters, with no visible mechanism. The third is infrastructural rather than vehicular in the individual sense. A transit system. Something that functioned at the scale of a city or a trade corridor, rather than at the scale of a single conveyance. The documentation here is the most fragmentary, because what survives are the ancillary records, the maintenance logs, and the administrative inventories, and the complaint filings about service disruption, the kind of bureaucratic sediment that accumulates around any large-scale infrastructure, and that is the last thing to be systematically destroyed, because it seems the least significant. What this sediment describes is a system of enclosed conduits running beneath the major Tartarian cities, through which vehicles moved at speeds that the maintenance logs, when calculating inspection schedules and component replacement intervals, imply were substantially higher than anything achievable on the surface routes. A subway, with vehicles moving at speeds that the maintenance documentation implies were not limited by the mechanical constraints that limit every subway system that modern engineering has ever built. The comparison to modern vehicles is not rhetorical. It is specific, and it is worth being specific about, because the specificity is what the official history cannot accommodate without unraveling. The fastest production automobile currently available sustains approximately 350 kilometers per hour under optimal conditions on prepared surfaces, with a powertrain that requires either hydrocarbon fuel burned at significant thermodynamic inefficiency, or a battery system whose energy density and weight impose hard limits on range and performance. The engineering that produced this vehicle represents the accumulated output of 140 years of sustained industrial development, the largest coordinated research enterprise in the history of human technology, operating under competitive pressure that has driven optimization to a degree unprecedented in any other field. The ground runner, by the accounts of European travelers who had no reason to exaggerate in a direction that would make the civilization they encountered seem more advanced than their own, sustained 60 to 80 kilometers per hour across terrain that no modern production vehicle can handle at those speeds. It did this in silence, without fuel resupply stops, in the 14th or 15th century. That is not a comparison that resolves in favor of the modern vehicle. The sky skimmer hovers. No production vehicle hovers. The closest modern approximation is a hovercraft, which achieves surface separation by blasting pressurized air downward, which is loud, which requires a prepared or water surface to function, and which cannot operate at the separation heights the Tartarian accounts describe. The other approximation is magnetic levitation, which requires a precisely engineered track and produces no separation outside of that track's magnetic field. Neither approximation is the thing the accounts describe. The accounts describe something that hovered independently of surface preparation, independently of an engineered field, in the way that something hovers when the mechanism is in the vehicle rather than in the ground beneath it. Modern engineering does not have this. Not in prototype, not in laboratory demonstration, not in theoretical proposal that has survived peer review. The thing the accounts describe is, by the standards of contemporary physics as publicly understood, not possible, which is a statement about the limits of contemporary physics as publicly understood, not a statement about the accounts. There is a question that this evidence presses toward, and it is not the question of whether the technology existed. The cartographic record, the traveler accounts, the metallurgical anomalies, the machined components with the wrong alloys in the wrong century, the maintenance logs of an underground transit system that has no place in the official history of the cities above it. These converge on a picture that the question of existence does not do justice to. The picture is already there. The question the evidence presses toward is simpler and more uncomfortable. Where did it go? Civilizations do not lose technology in the way that individuals lose keys. Knowledge of how to build something, once embedded in an industrial tradition, in the educational structures and the apprenticeship networks and the material supply chains that an operating technology requires, does not disappear through neglect. It disappears through interruption, through the cutting of the chains that carry it from one generation to the next, through the replacement of the people who knew the thing with people who have been educated to know different things, in institutions that have been deliberately structured to produce a specific kind of knowing and to make other kinds of knowing feel like the absence of knowledge rather than its suppression. The 1890 to 1920 window, the Smithsonian's transformation into a curatorial institution with explicit authority to classify and in some cases retain from public access objects that complicated the emerging official narrative. The street renamings, the demolitions, the building replacements, the textbook standardization, the defunding of the researchers whose theoretical work pointed in the direction the technology would have required. These are not separate events that happen to cluster in the same decade. They are the overlapping edges of a single operation. An operation whose scope and whose coordination require a directing intelligence that the official history cannot acknowledge without dismantling itself. The vehicles are gone because the people who knew how to build them were gone. The people who knew how to build them were gone because the civilization that produced them was gone. The civilization that produced them was gone because its removal was coordinated, systematic, and accompanied by a replacement of the evidence that would have marked its absence. Not in the blunt sense of burning libraries, though there is evidence for that too. In the fires that destroyed civic buildings in city after city during the urban improvement period, fires whose origins the contemporary press reported as mysterious, and whose consequences always included the loss of municipal archive material, in the more elegant sense of replacing the signposts, of renaming the streets that pointed somewhere, of ensuring that the generation born after the operation would have no inherited sense that there was something to look for, and therefore would not look. You drive a vehicle that runs on exploding gasoline, or on a battery that will be obsolete and toxic in a decade, across roads named after presidents and trees, past buildings whose architectural sophistication the official history explains with renovations that left no record, in a city that the official history accounts for completely, from a specific founding date forward, with no predecessor, no prior administrative regime, no gap in the record that would suggest that someone was standing on land They had taken from a civilization sophisticated enough to hover in silence and move through underground conduits at speeds the 21st century has not matched. The vehicles are not lost the way things are lost when no one was paying attention. They are lost the way things are lost when someone was paying very close attention and needed, with some urgency, for you to stop.